been watching the channel for any length of time, you probably recognize this truck. This is a 28 Roadster Pickup that belongs to a friend of mine, Jeff. We did a video probably over a year ago now of replacing some broken head studs in this thing when he swapped the head out on it. We got that all fixed and he'd been running it for a while and it's developed a new problem now. So before we jump into trying to figure out what's wrong with this, let's take a look at it and see what he's done for updates on it since the last time you saw it. So if you didn't happen to see the video on us replacing the head studs on this, check up in the corner up over in this general vicinity here, and I'll put a link to that up in there. So this is the same engine that was in it when we were working on it. Got all the head studs out, replaced them with new ones. Ended up going with a reproduction 6.0 Winfield head. I bought a bunch of these off the guy that used to make them for Snyder's. I don't believe he makes them for Snyder's anymore. I think you can still buy these directly through him though. So I've got a few of them. I've got some 6s and 7s. That's a 6. So aside from the head, he also went with a FSI distributor, which those use a Pertronix internals. So you get rid of the points and all that. It's got a Burns single downdraft intake, a reproduction Stromberg 97 carburetor, and a 4-into-2 header from Red's Headers. Now, since he's running a downdraft carburetor, it needs some sort of a fuel pump because these things will only run down to about half a tank or so before they start running out of fuel if you don't have a fuel pump. So I don't know what brand these are, where he got them from. That's the pump and that's the regulator filter type thing. They're pretty neat though. They've got like an old aircraft style look to them, so they kind of fit right in really well there. And it's also got a replacement aluminum radiator and an aluminum fan. So underneath here you can see the Red's header actually has 2 outlets, and it's running actual true dual exhaust on it. A little bit dark under here. I didn't grab a light, but you can kind of tell where the pipes run, and it dumps out just ahead of the rear axle. So with all the goodies added onto this thing, this truck actually went pretty well. I mean, they only make 40 horsepower when they're stock. I bet this saw a good 10 horsepower increase. I mean, it made a pretty significant difference. And on top of that, being a Roadster Pickup, the body doesn't weigh hardly anything, so it doesn't take much to get these things moving. He's also running 16-inch wire wheels on it. It's got 716s on the back and 600s on the front. And the rest of the truck is pretty much stock. So the reason it's here today is that after all the upgrades, he'd been driving it for a little bit, put some miles on it, and it seemed to go really well. And then all of a sudden, one day, it started to develop this noise. And within, I think, like 10 miles, he said, it went from just a real slight noise to a very, very deep, heavy knock. After that, he stopped driving it, moved it around a little bit. That was probably a year ago. He drove it a little bit, just kind of in and out of the garage and around the yard and stuff, no real long trips. And it's a really pronounced, heavy knocking sound. Obviously, his first thought was, it puked a Babbitt having the high compression head on it and stuff. It's kind of a concern. So when it first started, we listened to it and tried to diagnose it, just, from poking around. I've got a stethoscope and we're trying to listen around, and it sounded to me like it was either center back on the engine. It's definitely a lower end thing, but the tone is so deep, it sounded too deep for a bearing, even a main bearing to me. He was kind of concerned that, like I said, it puked a Babbitt. If it had barfed the rear Babbitt, it would probably be leaking a lot of oil. It wasn't, any more than usual anyway. So we poked around, couldn't really figure it out at the time. He parked it. That was, again, probably a year ago at this point. Decided he wanted to get back on it. Either, if it needs a motor, we got to do a motor. If it is something else, we just need to figure out what it is and do something with this. So Jeff had pulled the oil pan off on his own just to kind of check, see if there's anything obvious underneath. He said there was no debris in the oil pan, which to me says it's probably not a Babbitt, because there would be something in there if it was that pronounced of a noise. There would be some kind of material chunks or filings or something in there. And he said there was nothing in the oil pan. So that led me to believe that there's some other issue going on. The Babbitt's still an option, but it made me think that there was something else going on. So I'm going to fire it up for you so you can hear what I'm talking about. And it's very, very pronounced. You won't be able to miss it. I don't know how well I'll be able to get you in here to see this, but we pulled this lower inspection cover off here that's in behind the oil pan. And if you can see that, there is actually no cotter pins on the main cap nuts. So that's not a good start. So the backstory on the assembly of this truck, when Jeff got it, it was half-assedly put together. The engine, transmission, rear end were all in there and bolted down. So we made the assumption that they were, probably ready to go. The body was only kind of half-assedly bolted down. There's a few things that weren't done real well. So he went through and fixed a lot of that. We probably shouldn't have assumed that the drivetrain was ready to go. So this morning, having two of us here, we were able to kind of pinpoint what the noise was. Where when he was trying to do it by himself, obviously it's pretty difficult to try to move things around and listen at the same time. So we were able to kind of rotate the engine, figure out when it was making the noise, what you had to do to make it make the noise. And we were able to duplicate it without actually having to run it. So with the two of us working on it, we were able to pinpoint what it was. So as I'd mentioned earlier, it sounds like too deep of a noise for even the main bearing to me. It sounded like something. We initially thought something in the clutch, but it didn't seem to make any difference when stepping on the clutch and nothing seemed loose. But it's a really, such a deep sound. It just made me think it was something heavier than the crankshaft. So what we ended up doing was pulling this top inspection cover off so you can see down into the flywheel. And he was up front with the crankshaft and I was up back here with the flywheel. And you can put a wrench on one of the pressure plate bolts and kind of rock the flywheel back and forth. I'm pretty sure you can hear that. Let me get the light out of the way here so we can see what we're doing out in here. So that's obviously not turning the engine over. So once we figured that out, I was able to get underneath and I had Jeff up here doing this. And I could get my hand up in that lower inspection cover and feel the backside of the crankshaft where the flywheel connects. And you could feel while doing this that the flywheel was moving and the crankshaft wasn't. So what had happened was whoever put this thing together didn't safety wire or didn't even tighten the flywheel bolt. So they must have tightened them because he was driving this for a while and it was fine. So they probably just didn't safety wire them and didn't tighten them enough. So what that noise is the flywheel bolts are loose and the flywheel is rocking back and forth on the crankshaft. That's what that noise was. So we're going to pull the transmission out. And since we have to do that, there's a few upgrades that Jeff wanted to do anyway, so we're going to do a bunch of work to this thing and fix that noise and make this a better driver and better looking truck. So we pulled the front end completely out of this thing. You obviously don't need to do that to get the transmission and rear end out. The wishbone does tie into the bell housing, so you have to unhook that. We had a bunch of front end work to do anyway. Kingpins, spring. I actually did videos on doing both of those. So it's just easier to take that all out. But now we're going to move on to getting the rear end out of it and get the wheels off it. Got to get the coupler unhooked inside there, get the brake rods all taken off. And it shouldn't be too hard to get that down and out of there. And then comes the transmission. And then we can finally get a better look at the flywheel and make sure that is the issue. If you're pulling the whole rear end out, it is definitely way easier to unhook your brake rods from up in the front than it is to try to get them in the back, because it's really tight in the back. Trying to fight with the cotter pins up here, it's real easy to get at. Pull your cotter pins, pull your pins, plus your anti-rattle springy things are attached right to your radius rods anyway, so it's going to keep the rods on the rear end, so it's way easier to do it this way. That's all unhooked. We'll get the other side. So as you saw, we're getting ready to pull the rear U-bolts off. And something you definitely want to keep in mind with these, especially with the rear springs, because there's a ton of tension in these things. Inspect that center bolt before you go taking the U-bolts off. I don't know if I can get you in here that well to see it, but see how rotted the nut is on that? These U-bolts are probably all that's holding that spring together. If you take those off, there's a chance that that center bolt could let go. And if that happens when you're taking this out, that would be a very bad day. That is going to put the brakes on this for today. We're going to have to pull the bed off. We considered replacing the rear U-bolts anyway because they're kind of crusty. And to do that, the bed has to come off. So now we're definitely taking the bed off. That way we can kind of get this thing clamped while we remove those and you know, kind of systematically take this thing apart instead of having it explode while we're trying to take it out. So the bed is where we're at with that. So the bed is off. Looks a little goofy now with no bed on it. But now we can get in here and get some big clamps around the cross member and around that spring pack. So when I take this thing apart, if that center bolt does let go, it won't go flying, because it would not be a good day if that happened. So I'm gonna dig out my big C clamps, get this thing set up. I'll probably just take this center bolt apart because I mean realistically there's barely anything left of that nut anyways. So I'll probably just take that apart if it'll come apart. That way we don't have to worry about it later on. And I'll release this with the C clamps with it in the cross member. I'm not even sure how I'm going to get this thing apart. This thing's definitely been messed with. I think a few of the leaves have been removed. It doesn't look like there's 10 leaves in there like it should have. It definitely has a different center bolt because it's a round center bolt, it's not even square. And the lower nut, as I showed a second ago, is almost entirely rotted away, so I'm not sure I'll be able to get that off of there. But I don't know. I'm gonna have to cut it off, but look at the clamps on here. If you haven't messed with these rear springs, these things are not a joke. They're not like, you know, newer car leaf springs where there's a tiny bit of tension on them. These things get ugly. You don't want to just pull them apart and let stuff fly, because they'll probably rearrange your face. I have seen people use super sketchy ways of taking these apart too. It goes way too far. You know, I've seen a guy use one of those crappy spare tire screw jacks to use it as a spring spreader. And like, maybe it works. I would never try it. This is the best method I've found. Big C clamps. Yeah, it's not going to go anywhere now, so you are pretty safe to try to get that center bolt out of there. I'm going to try heating it anyway before I even try pulling it off. So with any luck, it'll just break. There, that's what's left of that center nut. You can get a little better look at it. That side is almost completely gone. I don't think that would have held up very well. Who knows? If it was going to come apart, it probably would have done it at the absolute worst time. The thing was halfway out, and no way to support it, so it's worth inspecting that before you go taking this thing all apart, because you don't want to run into an issue with that. So one thing to point out at this point, and I've kind of emphasized on it a little bit already, but it really can't be said enough, just how much tension is in this spring. If you try to undo this and don't have something to contain the spring, it'll actually lift the truck. Like if I get the rear end supported, it'll lift the frame of the truck right up off the rear end and knock it off the jack stands. So don't think that the weight of this, even if the bed was still on it, even if it was a full-bodied car, a four-door car, it's still not heavy enough to compress that spring. So if you undo this thinking that the car is going to hold it together, it's not. It's just going to lift the car, and it's still going to make a mess. And if you're in a situation like this where it's on stands, it's actually going to knock the truck off the stands, and that obviously would not be good. The other thing to keep in mind is if you have the front or rear end out, your jack stands are going to be more towards the center of the vehicle just to clear the wishbones and the radius rods. Now, like I said, there's very little weight in the back of this thing, obviously with the engine in it. All the weight's right here. Now you see where we had to put the jack stands to get the front end out of it. The engine is mostly in front of those jack stands, which means this thing is super front heavy. If you don't support it in front of the engine, when you take that rear end out, it will again do this. Pretty much guaranteed it'll nosedive off those stands. So make sure you support it up towards the end of the frame if there's no front end in it, or if you get the wheels in there, that'll put something under the wheels to hold it. But in a situation like this, you need to have something up here, or this thing will come off the stands. The other thing to keep in mind here is I already have the coupler off, so there's nothing holding this in the front. You don't want to let that torque tube come down and hit the floor, because it'll dent the end of it and then it won't fit right. So I'm going to put a jack stand up into the front of that to support that, just in case it decides to come back out. We don't smash off the floor. So right now the U-bolts are still on here. Those are going to support this to some extent, so I'm going to let those out a little bit further. It's a good idea to use those as kind of a safety thing for as far as you can. Start letting off these. Hopefully that spring will start to come apart. I would imagine that center bolt's going to hang up a little bit, but there's a whole lot of tension here to push those apart. So. Again, I'm putting the jack under it to support it, but if you don't let that jack down, it'll lift the truck off the jack, so that's not what we want. I'll put that down a little bit. Give me some room here. We'll start to put these down. I think that center bolt is hanging up. It's kind of what I was afraid of. Yeah, I think that's helping. A lot more tension on these now. This works a lot better if you got two people. You can kind of simultaneously release these things a little quicker. That'll limit how far things can go, if nothing else. I think it'll be alright. Always a good idea just to, in case. There's a lot of travel in these too. I mean, when these things are apart, there's like that much height to them, so it takes a while to get all the tension off. Well, there you have it, the original spring. I got 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I think these are supposed to have 10 or 11 in them. Oh, actually, because it's a Roadster pickup, that's probably why it has 9. I think the regular pickups had 10. But it has definitely been apart before because that is not an original center bolt. You can see how it's round and slotted. That is not original to that. Another thing to note is the top leaf. These are beveled on the edges like this because the cross member is not perfectly square in the corners. So if you try to take one of these leaves and stick it up in there, it won't sit perfectly flat in here because the corners are going to catch. So if you're going to use a different top leaf, or if you're using an aftermarket spring pack that maybe doesn't have this, take your angle grinder and knock the corner off of that so it'll sit up in there nice and flush like that. And it's supposed to be a piece of welting, like your frame welting. Would have sat on top of this. That's probably what this is, probably remnants of that. That just keeps it from squeaking. It's not a huge deal one way or the other. These actually aren't horrible, but they're kind of rusty. Oh yeah, you can see where they're pretty badly pitted. And plus these things have sharp edges on them and they dig into the leaf underneath them if they're not maintained well. Yeah, it's got some real bad pitting right there. You can see on that where that one was digging in, wearing that leaf right out. So these are all going to get replaced anyway. We'll probably just make spacers out of these, you know, cut this much out of all of them, save that so when we do leave some other vehicle, I have spacers to make it up. I have to use probably 3 or 4 on this one to make up this height anyways. So. And the rear end is all out. So we're going to move on to hopefully getting the transmission out tonight. I'd like to have this thing completely disassembled to be able to verify what exactly is wrong with it. You know, I want to see the flywheel bolts, the back side of the crankshaft to make sure that there's no other issues going on. So we're close. Hopefully I can get it out tonight. Well, 2 issues have popped up. First off, I forgot that the transmission bolts to the bell housing from the inside and not the outside. My plan was to pull the tranny off and then pull the bell off because it would give me a little more room to move stuff around. That isn't possible, so it all has to come off as one unit, which means first off, the clutch pedal is going to have to come off. Secondly, I'm going to have to pull the inside exhaust pipe because if you can see right there, there's very little room between them. There's no way I'm going to be able to move the transmission back far enough to get it out. I'm hoping with those 2 things off, there'll be enough room between the cross member and the back of the tranny to get it back and down, hopefully, because if not, I'll have to pull the brake service shaft off, which is right there, and I don't really want to mess with that. So get under there, pull those, well, pull just that from underneath. While I'm under there, I'm going to get all the lower bell housing bolts. That way when we get back up top here, I can just get that pedal off. And hopefully those upper bolts, and hopefully the whole thing will just come out. So hopefully. Alright, so I'm going to get the jack in place underneath that, get the clutch pedal off, and we should be ready to pull the rest of the bolts and hopefully the transmission out. Doesn't sound good either. I don't think the clutch disc is supposed to do that, is it? Huh. Alright, I guess we got a few issues going on here. Well, let's grab the impact gun and get the pressure plate off there. I'll get a better look at what's going on with that. I hope. Alright, let's get in here and see what is actually going on. Well, it is safety wired. I did not expect that. So they sit, look at this. I can move this bolt by hand. So they safety wired it, but didn't actually tighten them down. Either that or they ripped the threads out of the crankshaft, which I'm hoping is not the case, because that would be really bad. But it is safety wired, which I did not expect. Safety wire out of here. It seems odd that it's wired and not tight, so that kind of worries me now that there may be something else going on. Maybe the threads are damaged, or who knows. I thought for sure they just forgot to tighten them up, and In which case they wouldn't have wired it either, so we'll find out here in a minute. So that one, yeah, that one's finger tight, so that definitely worries me. Huh. I mean, the threads look okay, other than where it's been banging around on there. That, yeah, I mean, they're all finger tight. Well, I want to try tightening that up and just see what the threads in the crankshaft, if they're hopefully still good. It'd be really bad if they aren't good. But I just want to see if that'll tighten up. I mean, they're tightening up. So I think that means the threads in the crank are good. Look at that. It doesn't clunk anymore. So that's the one I just tightened up. That one I have not put a wrench on, that's finger tight. That one I didn't put a wrench on, that was finger tight. And that one I haven't put a wrench on, and that was also finger tight. So these were all in here, finger tight, and safety wired. So how weird is that? Alright, this is going to be tricky. I think I'm going to get the transmission jack back under this. This flywheel is like 65 pounds, and I don't really want to try to muscle that out of there. So let's get the transmission out of the way. And I'll get the jack back under that and try to ease it off onto the jack. That's gonna be it. Let's get this thing out of here before we make a final determination. Yeah. That is just weird. Very, very weird. This is a little bit better. Alright, I gotta relocate my light. Stay there? Or are you gonna stay there? You might. Let's go down. Going down. Ouch, 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 fingers. There you go. There you go. Nice. I think that'll actually stay right there. Maybe not. Stay right there though. Alright. Well, how well this will show up, but the threads look pretty good, so yeah, probably not going to show up very well on camera, but you get the idea. I think the threads will be alright. We got new bolts. I'll torque them down, Loctite them, safety wire them, all that good stuff. But I don't see anything else going on. I got a couple other things we want to do to this thing in the meantime. But luckily, I think our diagnosis was correct. So I got done what I was hoping to do. I wanted to have this thing all apart today and just verify what we thought was wrong with it. So the next step with this is I'm going to work on the rear end. We're doing reverse side springs and stuff on it, which I'll be doing in another video. In the meantime, I'm not putting that flywheel back in. Ryan Tebow over to Tebow Barn in New Hampshire, who does Model A and T restorations, is making a lightened flywheel for me with a V8 clutch setup. So that's what'll be going in here. So once he's all done with that, I'll go over and grab it and we'll get that reinstalled. That'll be the second part of the video on this. This is going to wrap up this video just because it's going to be a bit of a time break between getting this apart and getting that new one set up. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this, found it interesting. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel, throw the video a like, it helps me out, and in turn allows me to make better stuff for you guys to watch. So as always, appreciate you watching, and we'll catch you on the next one.